Thank you, Mr. President. Before I start talking a little bit about my friend Senator Lee's budget, I would like to respond to the senator from Iowa in terms of interest rates. Instead of talking about student rates, let me talk a little bit about America's average borrowing cost. Certainly what I've done is I've delved into the budget. I've taken a look at the history, and from 1970 to 1999, over that 30-year period, the average borrowing cost of the United States was 5.3%. And by the way, that was when America was a far more credit-worthy nation, when our debt-to-GDP ratio ranged from about 40 to 67%. Now our debt-to-GDP ratio is over 100%. Over the last 3 years, our average borrowing cost has been kept artificially low at 1.5%. So if my concern, by not seriously addressing the problem, by not actually passing a real budget that starts reining in the growth in government, I'm concerned that we're going to go from that 1.5% and revert back to that average mean borrowing cost of 5.3%. If we do, that 3.8% differential would add $600 to $700 billion per year to America's interest expense, and that would crowd out 60 to 70% of all discretionary spending. That's the interest rate that I'm concerned. That's the day of reckoning that I'm concerned about, when global investors look at the United States and say, you know what, not going to loan you any more money, or what's more likely to occur is they will say, we'll loan you money, but at a far higher rate. But having made that statement, I would like to talk a little bit about my friend Senator Lee's budget and the things I like about it. One of the things I like to do is actually take a look at history here and point out, I know a lot of us say that we don't have a tax problem. We don't. It's not that we tax too little for the American public. It's because we spend too much. And I think this is some pretty graphic proof. Here's 10-year spending levels. From 1992 to the year 2000, the federal government spent a total of $16 trillion over that 10-year period. Over the last 10 years, from 2002 through 2011, the federal government spent $28 trillion. And now the debate moving forward is, according to President Obama's just released budget, he would like to spend $47 trillion over the next 10 years. The House budget would spend $40, and I guess what I like about Senator Lee's budget is he would come in and spend about $37 trillion and put ourselves on a more aggressive path toward fiscal sanity. Now, we hear about draconian cuts all the time. You don't have to be a math major to realize that $37, $40, or $47 trillion is not a cut from $28 trillion. All we're trying to do is reduce the rate of growth. Another thing I like about Senator Lee's budget can be illustrated in terms of a chart that shows total federal debt. I start this chart in 1987, the tail end of Ronald Reagan's administration, when our total federal debt was $2.3 trillion. I like to point out that it took us 200 years to incur $2.3 trillion. And of course, last year in the debt ceiling agreement, this Congress gave the President authority to increase our debt ceiling by $2.1 trillion. We'll go through that in less than 2 years. That's a problem. And of course, if you take a look at President Obama's budget, and you can see how quickly our national debt has increased, but according to President Obama's budget, in the year 2022, our total federal debt would be $25.9 trillion, up $10 trillion from what it is today. Senator Lee's budget would result in total debt of about $19.1 trillion. And even more importantly, he stabilizes and then reduces a very important metric, our overall debt-to-GDP ratio. That is what investors take a look at in terms of our creditworthiness. The other thing I like about Senator Lee's budget is that by 2022, it would reduce federal spending to 17.8% of the size of our economy. Now, if you're like me and you think really the root cause of our problem, our economic problem, is the size, the scope, all the rules, all the regulation, all of government's intrusion into our lives, and the resulting cost of government, this is the key metric. How large is the federal government in relationship to the size of our economy? Currently, the federal government takes 24 cents of every dollar that is generated by our economy. If you add in state and local governments, total government in the United States consumes 39.2%. 39 cents of every dollar filters through some level of government. And I don't know about you, but I don't find government particularly effective or efficient. To put that in perspective to, for example, European-style socialist nations, Norway last year was 40%. Greece, 47%. Anybody hear of Greece recently? That economic model is collapsing. And this is why Senator Lee's proposal is important. If you take a look at spending and revenue generation over the last 50 years, you can see spending from 1959 through 2008 averaged 20.2%. Over the last 3 years, we've increased that to 24%. Revenue generation has been 18.1% over that same time period. By the way, regardless of what our top marginal tax rate is, as much as our friends on the other side of the aisle want to punish success and increase marginal tax rates, the problem with that is it simply doesn't work. During my lifetime, top marginal tax rates have been 70%, or 90%, 70%, 50%, 28%, 35, 39.6, and now we're back down to 35%. And in all that time period, the average tax receipts, the maximum amount the federal government could extract from our economy, is averaged very tightly around that mean of 18.1%. If we ever have any chance of living within our means, we better get federal spending down to about that level. That's what Senator Lee's budget does. And so, again, I just want to thank my friend Senator Lee, as well as Senator Toomey and Senator Paul, for putting forward serious proposals. And I want to thank all Republicans in Congress that are actually voting for something, because, Mr. President, Republicans are proving that we are willing to be held accountable to the American people by putting a plan on the table and showing the American people what we would do to try and get our fiscal house in order. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.